Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel where we're going over the prophecies of World War III from the Orthodox Church. Today we're going to go over the prophecies regarding Kurdistan, the Kurds, what's going to happen to them, the history behind the issue, and what our saints, specifically Saint Paisios, says about what's going to happen. So I want to first go over an article on our newsletter, the HESYCHAST, about the history and then the future fulfillment of these prophecies. Let's begin. Kurds at a crossroads, geopolitics, prophecy, and the prospects of independence in 2026. Historical background, the Kurdish quest for statehood. The Kurds are often described as the world's largest ethnic group without a state, numbering over 30 million people across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. They have sought self-determination for over a century. After World War I, colonial-era treaties, like the unfulfilled Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, dangled the idea of a Kurdish state, only for it to be quashed by the modern borders of the Middle East. In the decades since, Kurds established autonomous regions where possible, notably the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and waged insurgencies elsewhere. A short-lived Republic of Machabad in 1946, today's Iran, proved fleeting, underscoring the Kurds' uphill battle in gaining sovereignty. In Iraq, Kurds secured autonomy after the 1991 Gulf War, eventually formalizing the Kurdistan Regional Government, KRG. The KRG has functioned like a state within a state since 1992, with its own parliament, military, and even foreign relations. By 2017, Kurdish leaders in Iraq felt confident enough to hold an independence referendum where 92% voted in favor of full independence. However, the Iraqi central government and neighboring states reacted harshly. Baghdad imposed sanctions and sent troops to assert federal control, while Turkey and Iran closed borders and threatened economically. Western democracies offered little support, effectively sidelining the Kurdish bid for statehood despite its peaceful, democratic expression. So again, 92% of Kurds are in favor of this idea as of 2017. I'm not sure how those numbers have changed, but we can assume that it's still going to be around this mark. Maybe even a little bit more. In Syria, the chaos of civil war allowed Syrian Kurds to carve out a self-governed zone called the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, AANES, commonly known as Rojava. Since 2012, Kurdish-led forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces or SDF, have controlled this region, implementing a unique experiment in multi-ethnic gender-equal governance. Their fighters gained international acclaim as the most effective ground force against ISIS. Yet despite this contribution, Syria's Kurds have received no international recognition. On the contrary, Turkey invaded parts of Kurdish-held Syria, and even Western allies have largely stayed silent on the Kurdish political rights. The US-led coalition maintains a military presence along the SDF to prevent an ISIS resurgence, implicitly helping the Kurds hold their territory. But the US has not formally recognized even a measure of autonomy for Rojava. In Turkey and Iran, where roughly half of all the Kurds live, any move toward Kurdish independence is viewed as an existential threat. Turkey fought a 40-year counterinsurgency against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, an armed group seeking Kurdish autonomy at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Iran has similarly suppressed Kurdish dissent, fearing separatism. Both states have historically cracked down on Kurdish language rights and political organizations to preempt any secessionist momentum. This historical context sets the stage for today's question. In light of recent developments, could an independent Turkish state finally achieve recognition in the coming year? Below, we examine the evolving geopolitics, the stances of key regional players, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and the role of international powers, alongside an intriguing layer of insight from Orthodox Christian prophecies that foresee an independent Kurdistan as part of a larger divine plan. Recent geopolitical developments shaping Kurdish aspirations. Several major developments in the past few years have reshuffled the deck for Kurdish statehood aspirations. Aftermath of the ISIS war. The defeat of ISIS by 2019, thanks in large part to Kurdish forces in Iraq and Syria, left the Kurds in control of larger territories than before. In Iraq, the KRG gained confidence, leading to the 2017 referendum, while in Syria, the SDF solidified its hold over roughly one quarter of the country. The Kurds' sacrifices won them global admiration, but not sovereignty. Western powers praised Kurdish fighters for vanquishing ISIS, yet still treated Kurdish independence as a political inconvenience, in stark contrast to their vocal support for other stateless nations like the Palestinians. Again, a lot of people in the West are now taking more concern with issues in the Middle East, especially recognizing the statehood of the Palestinians. So it's not that far-fetched now that they're going to follow this trend for other people like the Palestinians with the Kurds. Continuing. 2017 independence referendum backlash. The KRG's referendum, though landslide in result, triggered a swift rollback of Kurdish autonomy. Iraqi forces with Iranian support seized disputed territories, including oil-rich Kirkuk, from Kurdish control. Turkey closed airspace to the KRG. The message was clear. Neighbors would not tolerate a unilateral Kurdish state, and the international community would not intervene on the Kurds' behalf. This setback dampened open pushes for independence in the short term, but the desire for statehood remained deeply rooted among Kurds. Turkey's shifting stance and war fatigue. Under President Erdogan, Turkey had moved from a hopeful peace process with the Kurds from 2013 and 2015 back to hardline approach after the collapse of talks. However, an unexpected turn of events came in 2025. Abdullah Öcalan, the jailed PKK leader, issued an historic call ending the armed struggle. In a video message from prison, Öcalan announced the end of the group's armed struggle against Turkey, urging the PKK to disarm and pursue democratic politics instead. By mid-2025, the PKK declared it was disbanding as an armed force after 40-plus years of insurgency, holding symbolic disarmament ceremonies in Iraqi Kurdistan. Turkish officials, including President Erdogan, cautiously welcomed this voluntary transition to peace. Erdogan stated that the winners of this process will be the whole of Turkey, Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, emphasizing hope for a new era without blood. If sustained, this Kurdish-Turkish détente could alter Ankara's calculus. With the PKK threat neutralized, Turkey might feel less existential threatened by Kurdish political gains. That said, Turkish leaders remain firmly against any independent Kurdish state on their borders, even if domestic conflict abates. Syria's ongoing uncertainty. Syria's civil war is far from resolved. But as of late 2025, the Kurds still administer the north-east autonomously, while the Assad government and various rebel factions control other parts. The Kurds in Syria seek either autonomy or some form of federalism. Outright independence is constrained by major powers. Russia, backing Assad, and Turkey, hostile to Rojava, Both oppose Kurdish independence in Syria. The US has tried to shield Rojava from Turkish invasion, especially in the final year of the Biden administration, reinforcing US positions there to help Kurds hold their ground. Still, any lasting settlement for Syria will have to address the Kurd status, and there is a possibility that a new Syrian political order could legitimize Kurdish self-rule, if not full independence. Notably, the SDF's success and governance have won begrudging respect. Even France has acknowledged that the Kurds of Syria shall have their role to play in the country's future. The Middle East's geopolitical landscape is shifting in ways that could either help or hinder Kurdish hopes. Arab states are reconciling with the Assad regime. Iran is under internal pressures. Turkey's economy is struggling and faces challenging regional diplomacy. Again, Turkey is in hot waters right now with a lot of its neighboring countries, Greece, Israel, and yeah, they've got a lot of stuff going on right now. Continuing, there is speculation that great power competition, US versus Russia, Iran, could lead to the Kurds being used as strategic pawns. For instance, Washington might find an independent Kurdistan useful to counter Iranian influence in Iraq, or to reward the Kurds for helping defeat ISIS. Conversely, if Turkey firmly aligns with the West, or if a post-Erdogan government softens, Western powers might double down on supporting Turkey's unity to keep it happy at the Kurds' expense. The coming year will likely see continued negotiations and power broking around these issues, such as talks about reintegrating Syrian Kurdish regions into a new Syrian political framework and implementing the peace process in Turkey. Here's a map of Turkey, and the regions in purple are the more Kurdish speaking areas. So anywhere highlighted black, these are where the Kurds are, and the purple is how they're voting. Now we're going to go over some of the perspectives of each of the countries, especially the US, as the US, we know, according to the prophecies, actually plays quite an important part. Turkey's perspective. Turkey has the most to lose from an independent Kurdish state, and has long been the fiercest opponent. About 15 to 20% of Turkey's own population is Kurdish, mostly in the southeast. Ankara fears that an independent Kurdistan in Iraq or Syria would incite its own Kurds to seek secession. For decades, Turkey pursued hard assimilation policy internally, and it fought the PKK insurgency relentlessly, labeling the group as terrorist with US/EU concurrence. Turkish leaders of all stripes, secular and Islamists alike, have viewed Kurdish independence as a red line for Turkey's national security and territorial integrity. However, Turkey's stance is not entirely monolithic. Economically, Turkey developed a close partnership with the KRG in Iraq. Turkish businesses invest heavily in Iraqi Kurdistan, and until 2023, Turkey was the transit route for KRG's oil exports. This pragmatic relationship led to some hope Turkey might tolerate an Iraqi Kurdish state under the Masoud Barzani's leadership, as long as Turkey's own Kurds remained under control. Indeed, Turkey did not outright invade or attack the KRG during the 2017 independence bid, but it threatened punitive action and firmly backed Baghdad instead. Going into 2026, Turkey's position seems to be softening in tone with the peace process, yet it continues to insist on Syria's territorial and unity and cracks down on any hint of separatism at home. In short, unless a dramatic crisis or war intervenes, Turkey is unlikely to recognize a Kurdish state in the next year. In fact, it will pressure others to also withhold recognition. Iraq's perspective. The federal government of Iraq has a constitutional framework that grants significant autonomy to the KRG, but Baghdad staunchly opposes independence. From Iraq's view, Kurdish secession would mean losing a sizable chunk of territory, including oil fields, and could embolden other separatist movements. After the 2017 referendum, Baghdad not only militarily reasserted control over disputed areas, but also temporarily suspended Kurdistan's oil exports and budget payments, forcing the KRG to back down. That said, relations have since been on a path of negotiation. Erbil, the KRG capital, and Baghdad periodically hashed out revenue sharing, oil laws, and security cooperation. As of late 2025, an interim deal reopened the crucial Iraq-Turkey oil pipeline, restoring some economic normalcy to Iraqi Kurdistan. Baghdad's ideal scenario is to keep the Kurds within a unified Iraq, albeit with autonomy. The only foreseeable scenario where Iraq reluctantly lets Kurdistan go is if Iraq itself falls into chaos, or if an international consensus forces Baghdad's hand. Neither appears imminent in the next year. Thus, Iraq will continue offering the Kurds autonomy without sovereignty, at least for now. Syria's perspective. The Damascus government under Bashar al-Assad has promised to eventually reintegrate the Kurdish regions, insisting on Syria's unity. However, after years of civil war, Damascus lacks the capacity to retake Kurdish-held northeast by force. There have been on and off negotiations between Assad's regime and the Kurdish Autonomous Administration. Proposal generally resolve around cultural rights and local self-administration for Kurds in future decentralized Syria, but not independence. Assad is backed by Russia and Iran. Both oppose Kurdish independence, as Russia fears a domino effect in its own Caucasus region. Iran fears it for reasons discussed below. One wildcard: if Syria's regime were to change, example, a new government in Damascus more friendly to the West, it might conceivably strike a grand bargain with the Kurds. In early 2025, there were even reports of Syrian opposition forces ousting Assad, and suggestions that the US and Russia might trade concessions involving the Kurd status. For the coming year, the likely outcome is a continued stalemate. The Syrian Kurds will govern themselves de facto, but neither Damascus nor any foreign state is poised to recognize a breakaway Kurdish republic. Iran's perspective. Iran firmly rejects the idea of an independent Kurdistan. About 8 to 10% of Iran's population is Kurdish, concentrated in the northwest. And Iran has its own Kurdish dissident groups like PJAK, which it suppresses. Tehran views any Kurdish state next door as an outpost of American and Israeli influence, and a potential magnet for Iranian Kurds. Again, this is what I see as more plausible, that America and Israel would want to recognize the Kurdish state to have more influence over the region. Right now, Iran and Israel are going at it. Even after the Bondi shooting, which happened recently, Israel immediately blamed Iran, which I find very interesting. But we'll talk about that later. In recent years, Iran has even launched missile strikes against Kurdish opposition bases in Iraq to show its determination to quash separatism. Moreover, a Kurdish state could threaten Iran's strategic land routes. Iran cooperated with Turkey and Baghdad to isolate the KRG after the 2017 referendum, and it will undoubtedly do the same against any future Kurdish independence moves. The only scenario in which Iran might grudgingly accept a Kurdish state is one where Iran itself is internally weakened or undergoing political transformation, developments that are unpredictable in timing. As things stand, Iran will use its considerable influence in Baghdad and Damascus to block any recognition of Kurdish independence. So, the four countries which the Kurds are a part of, it is extremely unlikely that this will happen, right? That the Kurds will be recognized statehood. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is that if it does happen, as I will go over soon with the prophecies, that this is one of the signs of the great events to come and is one of the reasons why we need to be aware, because our saints say the most remarkable things and then they come true. For example, Elder Theodore of Crete, when he said they will bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities on Friday morning, right? And then it happens. This is just some of the examples that happen with these prophecies. It seems too unbelievable, and then it happens, which is why we need to trust our elders and saints. Continuing. US and international involvement, double standards and new calculations. Internationally, the Kurdish cause has long been met with sympathy in rhetoric, but inaction and practice. No major power officially supports carving out a new Kurdish state, largely out of respect for the sovereignty of the states involved and fear of setting a precedent. However, the geopolitical winds are always shifting, and 2025 has highlighted some stark contrasts and evolving interests. In late 2025, several Western countries moved toward recognizing Palestinian statehood. For example, France and Canada announced plans to recognize Palestine by September 2025, and the UK signaled it may follow suit. Kurds watched this with a mix of hope and frustration. On one hand, it shows international will to acknowledge stateless nations. On the other hand, why not us? Western governments have never even floated a UN resolution on Kurdish self-determination. As one commentator puts it, why is Palestinian statehood deemed a matter of justice, while Kurdistan statehood is treated as a political inconvenience? The Kurds' consistent alignment with the West, fighting ISIS, embracing democracy, has earned them applause but not sovereignty. This double standard is becoming more glaring, and Kurdish advocates are pressing the issue in international forums and media. It's possible that continued Western recognition of Palestine might have the way for greater discussion of Kurdish statehood as well, though no government has yet indicated such a plan. United States policy. The US finds itself in a delicate balancing act. It has been the Kurds' closest international partner militarily, especially in Syria and previously with the no-fly zone in Iraq. American special forces and diplomats work closely with Kurdish leaders. Yet the US also values the unity of Iraq and relies on Turkey as a NATO ally. Official US policy still supports Iraq's territorial integrity and a unified Syria. In 2017, Washington actually opposed the KRG's unilateral independence referendum and urged Kurdish leaders to settle for autonomy. At the same time, Washington has provided political cover and protection for the Syrian Kurdish administration by keeping troops on the ground, effectively ensuring a Kurdish zone survives in Syria. As the Biden administration ended its term, it took steps to fortify Rojava against potential threats. And US officials laud the Kurds' role in defeating ISIS. Still, US support has limits. For instance, when Syrian Kurds attempted local elections that might legitimize their administration, US officials discourage it so as to not anger Turkey. In the coming year, much depends on US strategic priorities. If countering Iran or Russia takes precedence, the US might empower the Kurds more, even hinting at statehood as leverage. Conversely, if stabilizing relations with Turkey is key, especially under a new US administration, Kurdish aspirations might be placed on the back burner again. European countries have historically championed human rights for Kurds, pressuring Turkey to improve cultural rights as an EU accession condition, for example. But they too stop short of backing independence. Europe's worry is that a Kurdish state could destabilize an already volatile region and trigger refugee flows or new conflicts. However, within Europe are voices of change. Several European Parliament members and national parliaments' resolutions have urged support for Kurdish self-determination in the context of thanking the Kurds for fighting ISIS. Russia's role is complex. At times, Moscow has courted the Kurds. It once allowed a Syrian Kurdish mission in Moscow to open, using them as a card against Turkey. Yet Russia ultimately sides with Damascus and Tehran in opposing a Western-aligned Kurdish state. See, this is what is interesting me, how a Kurdish state would be more Western-aligned, and with current geopolitical events, it would make sense that the US and Israel would now want a Kurdish state in the region to not only be against Iran, but also Russia. Notably, Israel is one of the few countries that has quietly supported Kurdish independence, seeing Kurds as non-Arab, non-Islamist allies in the region. Israeli flags were even waved in Erbil during the 2017 referendum celebrations. But even Israel has not formally recognized Kurdistan, likely to avoid antagonizing Turkey, and because open support could be used by Iran to discredit the Kurds. In international legal arena, Kurdish representatives often highlight that their case meets the same criteria used to justify other new states: a distinct people with a common language and culture, control of territory, proven ability to govern, and a historic grievance of persecution. Article 1 of the UN Covenant of Civil and Political Rights affirms the right of all peoples to self-determination. Despite this, realpolitik prevails. Global recognition requires a major power backing, which the Kurds lack so far. One scenario that could change calculations is a major regional war or a collapse of current states, providing an opportunity or pretext for Kurdistan to emerge. Interestingly, this is precisely the scenario foreseen in certain Orthodox Christian prophecies, which we turn to next. Orthodox Christian prophecies of Kurdish state, Saint Paisios' vision. Beyond the secular analysis, the Kurdish question also appears in the spiritual and prophetic tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church, in particular Saint Paisios of Manathos, a revered Greek Orthodox monk canonized for his wisdom and clairvoyant gifts, made striking prophecies about the future of Turkey and the emergence of a Kurdish state. His words, recorded by pilgrims and later published, have gained fame for seemingly predicting geopolitical shifts in the region. Saint Paisios the Athonite was renowned for bold prophecies about future wars and the fate of Turkey. Saint Paisios' prophecy of Turkey's dissection. Paisios foretold the time when Turkey, a nation he saw as having arisen without God's blessing, would be partitioned into multiple parts after a great war. Remarkably, he specified the beneficiaries of this partition. Turkey will be partitioned into 3 or 4 parts. We Greeks will take our lands, the Armenians theirs, and the Kurds their own. The Kurdish issue has already been set in motion. These things will happen, not immediately but soon, when the current generation ruling Turkey passes and a new generation of politicians come to power. According to Saint Paisios, the countdown had already begun for this outcome. He often linked it to a war involving major powers. For example, he believed a conflict over the Aegean Emilia, 6 nautical miles, would draw in Russia, leading to Turkey's downfall and restoration of Constantinople to Greece. In the chaos, Kurds and Armenians would finally gain independence of their ancestral lands. Essentially, an independent Kurdistan and a free Armenia would be carved out of eastern Turkey. Saint Paisios' prophecy explicitly mentions the Kurd struggle. He reassured listeners not to fear Turkish aggression because, in his view, Turkey's dissolution was in God's plan. On one occasion, he even pinpointed a geopolitical logic. After a Muslim state, Bosnia, was created in Europe in 1990, the West would turn and tell Turkey, now the Kurds and Armenians should also gain independence in the same way, as he vividly put it. I see them dissolving Turkey in a polite way. The Kurds and Armenians will rise up, and the Europeans will demand that these nations become independent. Thus, politely, they will cut Turkey to pieces. The Starling prophecy suggests that European powers, and broadly the Allies, will one day support Kurdish independence as part of redrawing Turkey's map, essentially flipping the script to favour those minorities under the guise of fairness, having earlier enabled a Muslim majority state in Europe, in example Bosnia. Paisios often emphasized that the Allied forces would ultimately destroy Turkey, not Greece itself. Turkey will be destroyed by its allies. It will be for our benefit. And there's one last quote which I found where someone asked him about the great events. And he was asked, when will these great events happen, right? The World War III. And he says, when the USA declares the establishment of an independent Kurdish state, then it is near. Saint Paisios confined to a beloved spiritual child who is still alive today. Moving into 2026, what to expect? As we head into 2026, the potential recognition of an independent Kurdish state stands at the nexus of recent geopolitical shifts and long-held spiritual expectations. While immediate official recognition would require a bold leap by the international community, the momentum of events is unmistakably moving in the Kurds' favor compared to past decades. They now have autonomous zones, battle-tested armed forces, and a narrative of resistance against extremism that has earned global respect. The US and others remain involved on the ground, and talk of peace and rights is replacing talk of terror and insurgency. Whether change comes through incremental political deals or is thrust upon the world by conflict, the idea of Kurdistan is closer to reality than ever before. As Saint Paisios advised, one should keep faith and hope, for if his words ring true, Ola fta thayinun efta seokeros, all these things will happen, the time has come. And even in realpolitik terms, one cannot rule out that in the not-so-distant future, the Kurds might finally take their rightful place on the map, turning prophecy into history. And all my sources for this are down here. Make sure to like it. The reason I wrote this, again, is I do believe all these events are close. So, again, is this a precursor to World War III? Now, the prophecies do indicate that, because when will these events happen in reference to World War III is when the USA declares the establishment of an independent Kurdish state. Then it is near. Now, with the nature of prophecies, this could be before, during, or after. I'm not sure how God operates. He could change the event slightly, but the idea of a Kurdish state being recognized is definitely on the menu. And what made me interested on this is that there's an article written by the Wall Street Journal where they claim that there will be a Kurdish state when America turns 250 years old, which is next year. Yeah, a Kurdish state for America's 250th birthday. This was written 2024. See, we got two articles actually, City Watch LA and the Wall Street Journal. So we'll have a little look at this. Never mind, I will not have a look at this. What is this? This is a scam. Why am I have to pay for this? Look, even with what we can read. First, it would counterbalance the growing influence of Turkey and Iran in the region. Second, a Kurdish state would be also to provide a stable democratic partner like Israel and Greece in the region of right. I don't have to read the entire article. That's all I have to read to know why a Kurdish state makes sense for the US in their role in the Middle East. Maybe it didn't make sense a few years ago, but now, more than ever, it really does. And given Trump's track record, Trump, all he wants to do is gain respect. Every war, internationally, he's trying to resolve. Especially Armenia, Azerbaijan, Israel, Iran, going up to blow up Venezuela, Nigeria, the Christians in Nigeria. This man, to his ego, wants to solve every conflict. And I do believe that Assad's fall, right, could be the gateway to an independent Kurdish statehood. Let's see what the other article says quickly. So this is what we read before. Second, a Kurdish state would also provide a stable democratic partner like Israel or Greece in a region rife with autocratic regimes. Third, the Kurds' history of protecting minorities such a state would offer a model of coexistence that could foster broader regional stability. Now's the time for America to act decisively in support of the Kurds. In 2026, America will celebrate its 250th birthday. Support for a free Kurdistan can be one of the many achievements of our great nation, in line with the legacy of the founding fathers and idea of liberty we championed. Very interesting. I'm going to end it there. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time. See you guys.